Alrighty, part 2. Now in this video we're going to be looking at how to use some of the different types of charts to plot our data. Note that these are the basic charts that we have available in Plotly, but there's plenty more charts available, and the best place to find out information about them is directly using the Plotly documentation. For each of the different charts that we're going through now, there'll be a link at the bottom of the page that you can go to find more details about that specific plot. First up, we have the line and scatter charts. Now you just created a basic line chart, so this one should be a little bit familiar to you now, but there's a couple of different things to note about setting up line and scatter charts. Firstly, we can see here that we can include multiple series on the same chart. Plotly has a concept called traces, and a trace represents each different one of our data series. There's also some default functionality that we get with charts from Plotly, such as being able to hover on a specific marker or a point in our data series and see the value of the marker at that point in the axes, as well as zooming in and panning around using the interface, which is known as the mode bar in the top right hand corner. You can see that we just got a notification there that by double clicking, we can zoom out to the original scale of our data. The last thing I want to mention is that line and scatter charts, although they have different representations, are essentially the same structure when we're creating the data. So a scatter chart refers to the individual data points being placed on the screen, like we can see with this blue series, which is trace 0. A line chart simply connects those different points, and then we can combine those to have this scatter and line chart, such in the case of trace 2. Let's take a look at how we set up our data objects for these kind of charts. One thing that might make it a little bit easier is to set up your individual traces as their own variables and then combine them into our data array at the very end of the process. For trace 0, which was our single points on the graph, we still need to provide the X and Y values as arrays filled with their data points. And then we need to provide two more properties. Firstly, the type property, which in this case is scatter. This is what is telling Plotly which type of plot we want to use. And then for the mode property, we want to include which type of that type we are using. So in this case, we're using the markers mode, which is specifically related to the scatter type. In our second trace, we can see that the type remains the same. It's still a scatter plot, but the mode has changed. So now we are representing the line mode, which is not including our individual data markers, but rather just the lines between them. The third trace shows us a combination of both lines and markers, and this will be what we could see with the green trace in the previous graph. Finally, we are combining all of our traces into our plot data variable. As I mentioned, seeing as this has to be an array, by including all of these traces in the array in the variable here, when it comes to the next line, we can include the plot data object, which is an array here, directly into our new plot function as an input parameter. Other than that, our plotly.newPlot function remains exactly the same as we saw in the previous simple example. The next chart or plot I want to present to you is a bar chart. This is another simple chart where all we need to provide is two sets of data. Firstly, the x-axis, which is our different categories that we're representing here, and then the y-axis, which is some value on a predefined scale. For the code, we can see that in this example, we are creating the plot data variable as an array with an object directly inside it, and this is the value of our individual data points. For our x property, we're still using an array, but this time, instead of numbers as the values, we have individual strings. And these strings are the labels that are used in the resulting graph. The y values are still numbers. They represent the values on the scale for each of those individual bars, and they correspond with the same order of the array in the x-axis. Then we can see that the type for this particular plot is bar. That's a string that you just have to remember to know when to use that if you want a bar chart. And then the last thing that you might want to include in your data object is the orientation property. Orientation property will default to V. V stands for vertical, and that's what results in the bars going up and down the page. But you can use H if you want to create a horizontal bar chart. Just don't forget, if you are going to create a horizontal bar chart, to swap the values of your X and Y axes. And that's as simple as copying the X here and pasting it down here and putting the Y up here. Then lastly, we have this same plotly.newPlot function with our two input parameters, this time using the plot data variable that we've created just above. All right, next chart, pie charts. This is another really commonly used chart that you might see online, and it's another really simple one to set up in our data object. So we've got a similar structure to before. We're creating our plot data array. The first index of that array is our object that we're using to create the pie chart. Our values, in this case, need to be the percentages that we're representing in our pie chart. Note that there's no X and Y properties here because it's not a graph in that sense. It's a chart that uses values and labels corresponding to those values. The values should be numbers, the labels should be strings. Lastly, we have the type property, and the type for this chart is a pie chart. So we use the string pie. As always, after we create the data, we need to use the plotly.newPlot function to render that to the screen. The last chart that I'm going to show you is a bubble chart. A bubble chart is still a scatter chart in a sense, but there's a couple of different things that we can change in order to represent additional dimensions of our data. So in this case, we have the x-axis representing some linear value. We have the y-axis representing a different numerical value. But the last dimension that we have to our data is the size of this marker. And the size of the marker doesn't correspond to what we're seeing when we hover over that marker. We're seeing the value of the y-axis, but we can change that later on, and we'll talk about hover interactions in a future tutorial. This is how we set up the data for our bubble chart. The bubble chart is just a scatter chart where we can set individual sizes for the markers that are represented on that scatter chart. So our setup for the data is exactly the same as it would be for a regular scatter chart. We've got our X and Y properties filled with their arrays of each of the individual data points. Then we have the type of scatter with the mode of markers to say that we don't want the lines or the lines and the markers. And then finally, we have a new object called marker. So this is an object that is nested within our trace object. And we can see that that object has one property at the moment called size. Size represents the diameter of the individual marker. And we can see that we have an array which corresponds to the number of items in our x-axis, or the number of items that we're representing in our data. So the first marker will have a size of 40, the second marker will have a size of 60, and so on. I want you to have a little think now about when it might be appropriate to use a bubble chart. What kind of data could you represent using not only the two dimensions of the x and y axes, but also the third dimension of the size of our individual markers? When it comes to plotting that data, in this case, I've wrapped our array around our trace object, stored that as the variable plot data, and then as always, we're calling our new plot function, passing in that data as our second input parameter. All right, those are 4 of the different charts that you can use from Plotly. They are only a few of the many, many charts that you can create using the Plotly library. Hopefully though, that shows you the consistency of using a library to create our charts, where all we need to do is change the type of data and its structure within our data objects in order to create a different type of chart. That's the benefit of using a library like Plotly versus creating the charts manually or from scratch. In the next video, we're going to look at how we can import our data using a CSV, which makes it a lot easier to set up complex data sets rather than creating the arrays directly in our code. I'll see you then.